Money changed hands in a dimly lit Boston warehouse. The price of a human life settled in crisp, banded $100 bills. They thought they were throwing the overweight, unwanted niece to the wolves to save their own skin. But they didn't know the wolf had been waiting for her all along. Penelope Hayes was used to taking up space in a world that constantly demanded she shrink. At a size 22, she was the glaring imperfection in the otherwise flawlessly curated old money facade of the Hayes family. They resided in a sprawling, ivy-choked brownstone in Boston's Beacon Hill, a house paid for by Hayes Global Transit, her Uncle Gregory's allegedly thriving shipping empire. In reality, the company was bleeding money. Gregory had spent the last 5 years making increasingly desperate gambles to maintain their lavish lifestyle, borrowing heavily from unregulated, dangerous lenders. Penelope, orphaned at 7 and taken in by Gregory as a tax write-off and an unpaid housekeeper, bore the brunt of his mounting stress. While her cousin Bianca received monthly allowances for Pilates retreats and designer wardrobes, Penelope was relegated to the basement room, forced to manage the household's accounting, cooking, and cleaning. "Move your massive self out of the hallway, Penelope," Gregory snapped on a freezing Tuesday evening, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit. He was sweating profusely, a stark contrast to the icy draft rattling the windows. "We are expecting a guest tonight, a very important investor. If you ruin this, I swear to God, I will throw you out on the street." Penelope kept her head down, her hands tightly gripping the feather duster. She retreated toward the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew what kind of investors Gregory dealt with lately. They didn't arrive in limousines. They arrived in black SUVs with tinted windows, and they usually carried firearms. At precisely 8 o'clock, the heavy oak front door didn't just open. It was thrust open. 5 men stepped into the foyer, bringing the scent of winter rain and expensive cologne with them. At their center stood Dominic Mercer. Dominic was a ghost in the New England underworld, a man whose name was whispered in boardrooms and back alleys alike. He was the head of the Mercer Syndicate, a ruthless organization that controlled the eastern seaboard's docks. He was violently handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features, piercing, cold blue eyes, and a broad-shouldered frame draped in a dark charcoal suit. He radiated an aura of quiet, lethal authority. From the swinging kitchen door, Penelope watched the interaction. Gregory was trembling, ushering Dominic into the grand parlor. Bianca, draped in a slinky silk dress, was strategically positioned by the fireplace, practically throwing herself at the syndicate boss. "Mr. Mercer," Gregory stammered, pouring a glass of scotch that shook in his hand. "I can explain the missed payments. The cargo from Rotterdam was seized at customs. I just need another 30 days. Dominic didn't take the glass. He didn't even look at Gregory. His gaze swept the room with clinical detachment. "You owe me $4.2 million, Gregory. The grace period expired at midnight. I didn't come here to negotiate a payment plan. I came to collect." "I don't have the cash," Gregory's voice cracked. Panic stripped away his aristocratic pretense. He looked frantically around the room, his eyes landing on his beautiful, slender daughter, Bianca, who suddenly looked terrified. Gregory swallowed hard, his survival instinct overriding whatever paternal affection he possessed. But before he could offer Bianca, his eyes darted toward the kitchen door. He saw Penelope's silhouette. A cruel, desperate light ignited in Gregory's eyes. "Wait," Gregory said, his voice rising in frantic pitch. "I have collateral, human collateral." He marched to the kitchen doors and violently yanked them open, grabbing Penelope by the arm and dragging her stumbling into the glaring light of the parlor. She gasped, trying to pull her oversized, faded cardigan around her body to hide herself. But Gregory's grip was like a vice. He shoved her forward, right to the center of the Persian rug, stopping just feet away from Dominic Mercer. "Take her," Gregory spat, pointing at Penelope. "She's my ward. I have full legal guardianship. Take her as payment. She's strong. She knows how to keep ledgers. She can cook, and she can scrub every inch of your warehouses. Look at her. She's practically built for heavy labor. Or sell her to the highest bidder in whatever underground trafficking ring you operate. Sold by the pound, she's certainly worth a fortune." Gregory let out a nervous, hysterical laugh, fully expecting the Mafia boss to join in the cruel joke. Penelope squeezed her eyes shut. Hot, humiliating tears pricked her lashes. This was it. Her uncle had finally found a way to dispose of the fat, ugly niece he despised so much. She braced herself for the Mafia boss's disgust, waiting for him to sneer at her heavy thighs, her soft stomach, her round face. She waited for the rejection. Silence stretched in the parlor. It was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. When Penelope finally dared to open her eyes, she found Dominic Mercer staring at her. But his expression wasn't one of disgust. His blue eyes traced the soft curve of her jaw, the fearful trembling of her full lips, and the terrified heaving of her chest. There was a dangerous, unreadable darkness swirling in his gaze. He slowly turned his head to look at Gregory. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The debt is settled." Dominic's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Gregory gasped in relief, a sickening grin spreading across his face. "Excellent. Take the fat pig and get out of my house." In a blur of motion too fast for the eye to track, Dominic crossed the space between them. His hand shot out, wrapping around Gregory's throat, lifting the older man an inch off the ground. Gregory choked, his face turning purple as Dominic leaned in close. "If you ever refer to her with such disrespect again," Dominic whispered, his tone terrifyingly calm, "I will slowly remove every inch of skin from your body while you watch. Do you understand?" Gregory nodded frantically, gagging for air. Dominic dropped him to the floor in a pathetic heap. Dominic then turned to Penelope. He didn't grab her. He didn't bark an order. Instead, he extended a large, scarred hand toward her. "Come with me, Penelope," he said softly. Shock rooted her to the spot. How did he know her name? Trembling, with nothing but the clothes on her back, Penelope reached out and placed her soft, trembling hand into the firm, calloused grip of a Mafia boss. The drive from Boston to the Mercer estate in the Hudson Valley took 4 hours. Penelope sat stiffly in the back of the armored SUV, pressing herself against the door to ensure her thigh didn't accidentally brush against Dominic's. She was terrified. Gregory's words echoed in her mind. Sell her to the highest bidder. Built for heavy labor. She assumed she was being taken to a trafficking hub or a warehouse to work until she dropped. Instead, the SUV rolled through towering wrought-iron gates, traveling up a winding driveway lined with ancient oaks, eventually stopping in front of a breathtaking, Gothic-style limestone mansion. Penelope was quickly ushered inside by 2 stoic guards. She prepared herself to be thrown into a cellar or a dingy maid's room. However, an older woman with kind eyes, introduced as Mrs. Gable, led her up the sweeping grand staircase to the east wing. "These are your quarters, Miss Penelope," Mrs. Gable said, opening double mahogany doors to reveal a suite that looked like it belonged to royalty. A massive king-sized bed with plush velvet bedding, a roaring fireplace, and a massive ensuite bathroom with a soaking tub. "There must be a mistake," Penelope whispered, clutching her worn cardigan tighter. I'm supposed to be the maid." "Or the collateral," Mrs. Gable offered a gentle, sad smile. "Mr. Mercer gave very specific instructions. You are a guest in this house. There are fresh clothes in the closet. Dinner is served at 8. When Penelope opened the closet, she expected to find nothing. Instead, it was filled with luxury clothing, sweaters, slacks, and dresses, all perfectly tailored to her size 22 frame. The tags were from high-end, inclusive boutiques she had only ever dreamed of window shopping at. Panic warred with confusion. Why would a mob boss buy a bespoke wardrobe for a hostage? That evening, Penelope summoned every ounce of her courage and made her way down to the formal dining room. She wore a simple, soft emerald green wrap dress from the closet. It hugged her curves and accentuated the rich tone of her skin, though she still felt painfully exposed. The dining room was massive, the long table set for an army, but only 3 men were present. Dominic sat at the head of the table. To his right was his underboss, Vincent, a wiry, sharp-faced man with a cruel smile, and a heavily tattooed enforcer named Leo. As Penelope entered, conversation ceased. Dominic stood up. The other men, noticing their boss rising, hastily scrambled to their feet. Dominic walked over to her, pulling out the chair immediately to his right. A seat of honor. "Sit," he instructed, his voice gentler than it had been in Boston. Penelope sat, her cheeks burning hot. The staff immediately brought out platters of roasted meats, fresh pasta and vegetables. Penelope, conditioned by years of Gregory slapping food out of her hands and Bianca calling her a glutton, took only a tiny spoonful of plain salad. Vincent let out a snorting laugh, swirling his red wine. "Come on now, sweetheart," Vincent sneered, his eyes raking over Penelope's full figure with obvious disdain. "We know a plate of lettuce isn't what keeps you looking so sturdy. Don't be shy on our account. Boss is footing the grocery bill now, and clearly it's gonna be a big one." The silence that followed was deafening. Penelope shrank into her chair, the familiar, crushing weight of humiliation settling on her chest. She closed her eyes, fighting back tears. This was it. The illusion was breaking. This was where they all laughed at her. The sound of shattering glass made her jump. Dominic had slammed his wine glass down onto the table with such force the crystal completely shattered, sending dark red wine and shards flying across the pristine white tablecloth. Vincent froze, the smirk instantly dropping from his face. Dominic didn't yell. His voice dropped to a lethally quiet register. "Vincent, stand up." Vincent swallowed hard, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor as he stood. "Boss, I was just making a joke." "You insulted the woman sitting at my right hand," Dominic said, slowly rising to his full height. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and methodically wiped the wine from his hand. "You disrespected her in my home." She's Gregory Hayes's collateral dom," Vincent stammered, sweating now. "She's just a bargaining chip." Dominic stepped around the table. Before anyone could blink, he grabbed Vincent by the back of his neck and slammed his face brutally into the polished mahogany table. The sickening crunch of bone echoed in the large room. Penelope gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Dominic yanked Vincent back up by his hair. The underboss's nose was shattered, blood pouring down his chin. "Let me make something perfectly clear to you, and to every single man in my syndicate," Dominic roared, his voice finally breaking its quiet restraint, vibrating with unhinged, possessive fury. "She is not collateral. She is not a maid. She is not a joke." Dominic released Vincent, shoving him backwards so hard, the man fell over his chair and hit the floor. Dominic turned back to the table, his chest heaving, his blue eyes blazing with a fire that sent a shiver down Penelope's spine. He walked over to Penelope, who was trembling violently. To her shock, Dominic dropped to one knee beside her chair, completely ignoring the bleeding man on the floor. He gently took her shaking hands in his thumbs softly caressing her knuckles. The violence of his previous action vanished, replaced by a terrifyingly intense devotion. "She is mine," Dominic declared, his eyes locked onto Penelope's wide, tear-filled gaze, making sure she heard every single word. "She has always been mine, and anyone who looks at her with anything less than absolute reverence will lose their eyes. Throw him out, Leo." As Leo dragged a groaning Vincent out of the dining room, Penelope stared at the ruthless Mafia boss kneeling before her. "Why?" Penelope finally choked out, a single tear spilling over her cheek. "I don't understand. I'm nobody, I'm just—" "You are, Penelope," Dominic interrupted softly, reaching up to wipe the tear from her face. "And you have no idea how long I've waited to get you out of that house." The fire crackled in the massive stone hearth of the library, casting long, dancing shadows across the leather-bound books. Penelope sat on the edge of a Chesterfield sofa, her hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them together in her lap. Dominic stood by the towering window, staring out at the rain-slicked grounds of the Hudson Valley estate. The violence in the dining room still hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of exactly who and what this man was. He was a monster to the world, a predator who broke bones without a second thought. Yet he had knelt for her. "I demand to know what is going on," Penelope said, her voice shaking but finding a sliver of strength. It was the first time in her 22 years she had ever demanded anything. "You are the head of the Mercer Syndicate. You deal in millions of dollars, illegal ports, and power. I am the fat, discarded niece of a bankrupt shipping heir. I scrubbed floors, I did taxes, I am invisible. So tell me why you acted like a madman in there. Tell me why you know my name." Dominic turned around slowly. The cold, ruthless mask he wore for his men had completely vanished, leaving behind a raw, agonizing vulnerability that took Penelope's breath away. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the Persian rug, and stopped just a few feet away. "You have never been invisible, Penelope," Dominic murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You were simply surrounded by blind fools. But I saw you. I have seen you every day for the last 10 years. Penelope gasped, shrinking back against the leather cushions. 10 years? That's impossible. I would have remembered you." "You do remember me," Dominic said softly. He reached into his tailored vest pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver object. He held it out in his broad palm. Penelope leaned forward, her eyes widening as she recognized the item. It was a vintage, silver-plated pocket watch, heavily dented, with the initials PH engraved on the back. It had belonged to her late father. She hadn't seen it since she was 12 years old. "You," Penelope breathed, the memory hitting her like a physical blow. A decade ago, a brutal winter storm had battered Boston. Penelope, then a terrified, overweight 12-year-old constantly berated by her Uncle Gregory, had been taking out the garbage in the freezing rain. In the dark, narrow alley behind the Hayes brownstone, she had tripped over a body. It was a teenage boy, no older than 18. Beaten so severely his face was unrecognizable, bleeding out in the snow. He was a low-level runner for a local loan shark, punished for losing a package. Penelope hadn't screamed. She hadn't called the police, knowing Gregory would beat her for involving the authorities. Instead, she had dragged the bleeding boy into the abandoned gardener's shed. For 3 weeks, she smuggled him leftover roast beef, penicillin stolen from her aunt's vanity, and warm blankets. She had sat with him in the dark, reading her favorite books aloud to keep him awake through the concussions. When he finally had the strength to leave, he had nothing to offer her in return. So she gave him her father's broken pocket watch. "For luck," she had told him, "so you can time your escape." "You were the boy in the shed," Penelope whispered, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "I was a street rat bleeding to death in the snow," Dominic corrected, kneeling before her once again. He placed the watch gently in her lap. "And you were an angel who smelled like vanilla and bleach. You saved my life, Penelope. You fed me when you were starving yourself, hiding from your uncle's wrath. I promised myself the day I walked out of that shed that I would build an empire. I would become untouchable, ruthless, and powerful enough to come back and tear Gregory Hayes's life apart piece by piece, just to get you out." Penelope sobbed, covering her face with her hands. The sheer magnitude of his devotion was terrifying and beautiful. "But look at me, Dominic. I'm not a mafia queen. I'm huge. I'm soft. I don't fit into this glamorous, dangerous world. Bianca is the one men fight over." Dominic's hands gently grasped her wrists, pulling them away from her face. His blue eyes burned with a fierce, unwavering obsession. "I do not want a fragile, starving porcelain doll. I want you. I love every soft curve of your body, every inch of your skin. Your strength kept me alive. Your heart is the only pure thing I have ever known. Do not ever let Gregory's poison make you believe you are anything less than a goddess." For the first time in her life, Penelope felt truly seen. She allowed herself to fall forward, and Dominic caught her, burying his face in her thick, dark hair, holding her securely against his chest as if she were his most prized possession. But miles away in Boston, the past was not done with them. Gregory Hayes sat in his ransacked office, nursing a bruised throat and a shattered ego. His financial advisor, Harrison, rushed into the room, holding a thick file of legal documents. "Mr. Hayes, I've found something," Harrison gasped, slamming the papers onto the desk. "I was reviewing the syndicate's financial transfers. Dominic Mercer didn't just forgive your $4 million debt. He transferred $20 million into a holding account. The moment you handed Penelope over, a legal trigger was activated." Gregory snatched the papers, his eyes scanning the fine print. His blood ran cold, and then boiled with rage. Dominic hadn't taken Penelope as collateral. Dominic had systematically destroyed Gregory's business over 5 years, sinking his ships and blocking his cargo, purposely driving Gregory into debt just to force this exact transaction. Dominic had orchestrated the entire downfall of the Hayes family, just to rescue the fat niece Gregory despised. "He played me," Gregory whispered, his hands shaking with fury. "He destroyed my empire for that useless, overweight pig." "There's more," Harrison stammered. "Penelope's father left a trust. You've been draining it illegally, but the core assets, the prime real estate in Manhattan, revert to her control the moment she marries or leaves your guardianship permanently. Mercer knows this. If he marries her, he owns the entire Eastern Seaboard logistics network." Gregory's eyes darkened with malevolent greed. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he had sworn never to call. The phone rang twice before a raspy voice answered. "Don Lucchese," Gregory said smoothly, a wicked smile twisting his lips. "I have a proposition. I know the one weakness of the Mercer Syndicate, and I know exactly how we can break Dominic Mercer." 3 weeks later, Penelope had blossomed under Dominic's fierce protection. The sprawling Mercer estate became her sanctuary. She no longer hid her curves under oversized, faded sweaters. Instead, she wore tailored, luxurious silks and cashmeres that hugged her full figure. Dominic treated her like absolute royalty. He commanded his ruthless enforcers to bow their heads when she entered a room, and he spent every evening listening to her read, just as she had done in the dark shed 10 years ago. It was a cold, bright Tuesday afternoon when Dominic insisted she visit Manhattan. "You need a gown for the Syndicate Gala," he had told her, kissing the soft skin of her neck. "I want the world to see the woman who owns my soul." Penelope arrived at the private fitting at a luxury boutique on Fifth Avenue, accompanied by Leo and another guard. She was standing on a pedestal, wearing a breathtaking crimson velvet gown that perfectly accentuated her heavy bust and wide hips, looking at her reflection with genuine awe. She finally felt beautiful. Suddenly, the front windows of the boutique shattered inward in a rain of glass. Automatic gunfire deafened the room. The boutique assistant screamed, diving for cover. Leo drew his weapon instantly, but a heavily armed tactical team swarmed the store. It was the Lucchese family's hit squad. They overwhelmed the guards in seconds. Penelope stumbled off the pedestal, her heart pounding in her ears. Through the smoke and chaos, a familiar, sneering face appeared. Gregory Hayes stepped over the shattered glass, flanked by Lucchese enforcers. "Hello, my darling niece," Gregory mocked, grabbing Penelope roughly by the arm. His fingers dug painfully into her flesh. "Did you really think playing house with a mobster made you untouchable? You're coming with me. Your little boyfriend is going to sign over his empire to get you back, and then I'm going to put you right back in the basement where you belong." Fear threatened to paralyze her, but as Gregory sneered at her, a profound realization washed over Penelope. She was not the terrified 12-year-old girl anymore. She was the woman who saved the most dangerous man in New York. She was a survivor. As a Lucchese enforcer stepped forward to bind her hands, Penelope didn't cower. Using the weight and strength her uncle had mocked for years, she pivoted hard, throwing her entire body weight against the enforcer. The man, caught off guard by the sheer force of her momentum, crashed violently backward through a display case, unconscious. Gregory's eyes widened in shock. "Grab her, you idiots!" Before the remaining men could react, the screech of tires echoed outside. A massive armored truck slammed directly through the already broken storefront, tearing the entrance apart. Dominic Mercer stepped out of the wreckage. He didn't look like a businessman today. He looked like the devil incarnate. Clad in a tactical vest, an assault rifle in his hands, his eyes locked onto Gregory with a murderous, unholy rage. Behind him, a dozen Mercer enforcers flooded the street. "Kill him!" Gregory screamed, pushing Penelope away and trying to run. The gunfight was brief, brutal, and entirely one-sided. The Mercer Syndicate dismantled the Lucchese hit squad with terrifying precision. Dominic walked through the gunfire as if he were invincible, never taking his eyes off Gregory. Gregory scrambled backward, tripping over a fallen mannequin, crying out as Dominic stood over him, the barrel of the rifle pointed directly at his chest. "Please, Dominic," Gregory begged, sobbing pathetic tears. "I'm her family. I raised her." "You tortured her," Dominic's voice was devoid of humanity. You starved her soul and mocked her existence, and then you dared to touch her again. Dominic didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The deafening crack echoed through the ruined boutique. Gregory Hayes slumped to the floor, dead before he realized what hit him. The tyrant who had tormented Penelope her entire life was gone. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the sirens wailing in the distance. Dominic dropped the rifle. He turned, his chest heaving, his dark suit covered in dust and blood. He frantically scanned the room until he found Penelope standing amidst the velvet and glass. He ran to her, falling to his knees and wrapping his arms tightly around her waist, burying his face in the soft curves of her stomach. He was shaking. The ruthless Mafia boss was trembling at the thought of losing her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, looking up at her, his hands frantically checking her arms and face. "Did he hurt you?" "I'm fine, Dominic," Penelope whispered, her hands sinking into his dark hair, comforting the monster who had become her savior. "I fought back. I'm okay." Dominic stood up, cupping her face in his large, scarred hands. He looked at her not with the lust of a conqueror, but with the profound, desperate reverence of a man worshipping his deity. Right there, in the middle of a ruined Fifth Avenue boutique, surrounded by his armed men and the bodies of their enemies, Dominic reached into his pocket. He pulled out a massive, flawless diamond ring that sparkled fiercely in the flashing red and blue lights of the approaching police cars. "Penelope Hayes," Dominic said, his voice loud enough for every surviving man in the room to hear. 10 years ago, you saved my life in the dark. Today, I want to spend the rest of my life bringing you into the light. You are my queen. You are the only power that rules me. Marry me, and let me spend my life proving that you are the most beautiful, worthy woman in this world." Tears streamed down Penelope's cheeks, not of fear, but of overwhelming, triumphant joy. She looked at the man who had burned down an empire just to see her smile. She looked at her own full, curvy reflection in the unbroken mirror, finally seeing the strength and beauty he saw. "Yes," she sobbed, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, Dominic, I am yours." Dominic swept her off her feet, easily lifting her into his arms, kissing her deeply as his men erupted into cheers. The overweight girl who was sold as collateral had just become the undisputed queen of the underworld, and no one would ever dare look down on her again. What a massive, breathtaking twist. Did you expect Dominic's secret connection to Penelope, or her incredible strength in the finale? If you loved seeing this curvy queen claim her power and her Mafia king, smash that like button right now. Share this incredible romance with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more dramatic, heart-pounding stories. Leave a comment below. What was your favorite moment between Dominic and Penelope? We'll see you in the next video.